Thank you guys for tuning in to part 2 of my interview series with Police Chief Zuidema of Lynchburg, Virginia, where we're continuing to try to bridge the gap to talk about the struggles and the challenges between policing and community. One love. Be blessed. All right. So when it comes to the community action group, so can you break that down and give us some details on that?
Yeah, so we started a group here called our Community Action Team, or CAT for short, and that group started out around 2016, 2017. And the idea behind that was, our officers are very much what we call call driven. Our uniform patrol officers are, young men and women that are out there, they're literally just going from one call to the next call to the next call. And, a lot of times that they get to these calls, they're really not dealing with the problems, they're dealing with the symptoms of the problems, right? They're getting there and they're putting Band-Aids on it, and then they're going on to the next one, and they don't really have, our patrol officers don't really have the time they need to really dig in and say, hey, what's the underlying problem here? How do we fix it? What's the need here? So the Community Action Team, or CAT, was formed, and they're a group of folks that are not responsible to answer day-to-day calls for service. They're the ones that go out, they get into the community, they find out where some of the challenges are, and they can go and spend hours, days, weeks if they need to fixing that problem. So the idea behind that is, they're building those relationships, they're having those partnerships in the community to find out what that underlying problem is. The analogy I always give, and this was way back in the day, probably 20 plus years ago now, but I think sometimes we make assumptions as human beings, and police officers too, about what a problem may be in the community. And we had a neighborhood where we got a grant, it was called a weed and seed grant in the late 90s to go in and kind of weed out what the problem was, and then put some new programs in place to kind of help the community flourish. And one of the first things our officers had to do is we had to go door to door with a survey, talking to residents like, hey, what are the biggest 3-4 problems you see in the community that you think we can help you address? And I'd have told you 100%. It was the drug dealers on the corners. This was, again, late 90s, where there was a lot of open air drug markets on the corners, no cell phones, people weren't doing business that way. And so we started going around and we started talking to people, and they were concerned about the drug dealing, but the biggest thing that one area was concerned about was a house on the corner that was boarded up, overgrown grass that was this tall. And kids were going in there and they were worried about them getting in the house and getting hurt and playing. And there was other stuff going on in the house after hours. It shouldn't be, because people broke into it. So, we make these assumptions, I think, sometimes, that we know what the problem is, but who knows best what the problem is in that community? People that live there, right?
Yeah.
So I say that to say, that's kind of what the Community Action Team can do. They can go in and find out what those problems are, and then they tie resources too. So, if it's a problem with a house that needs to be condemned or boarded up, they'll contact city inspections and get them involved, right? If it's a problem with something related to the road or the street, they'll call Public Works and they'll get them involved. If it's a problem that, hey, there's not enough activities, in the area or things going on, they'll reach out to different, whether it's Parks and Rec in the city or other non-governmental organizations, some of our faith-based groups, and try and work through that. So, it's a team that can go out there and really, be on the front edge of building relationships, making sure that they're addressing longer term problems. And it's not, just the police officer that shows up like, okay, Mr. Smith, tell me your problem right now, quick, okay, get the facts, right? Here's the solution, bam, I'm going to the next thing, right? Because what happens is we end up back at that same place, whether it's the next day, next week, or next month, and we haven't solved that problem. So that community action team is really important for us. And we'd love to have more officer staff with it. We're going to continue to work with city council to try and get some more resources to allocate towards that, because it's a great kind of bridge building group. So.
Okay. So could you tell me about the community policing advisory group? Is that kind of one and the same, or is that just two different?
Yeah, so different group, and that's the group we talked about just a little bit before. That group looks at helping us review policy, institute different procedures and changes. They review any critical incidents that we're involved in, and then they also are a group that a few years back helped us actually kind of streamline our recruiting process, right? So this community policing advisory group is made up of a wide, diverse group of folks in the community. We've got everything from nonprofit folks involved to business leaders, to college professors, school guidance counselors, and kind of everything in between. And a lot of them had a lot of experience in human resources when we were working on that, and so they helped us kind of take what was at the time a very long hiring process. It would take us, if you applied today, it might take us 6 months to actually hire you. Well, the reality is, in today's day and age, there's plenty of other places that'll hire you in 3 or 4 months to do this job, right? And we were losing a lot of people to other communities. So we streamlined that process quite a bit, and that was with the help of that community policing advisory group. So they're just a great resource for us, and provide a lot of guidance and counsel on a variety of different things for us. So we hope to continue to move that group forward and then help us provide better service to the community.
Okay. Now, when you're talking about the community group, because I just wanted to talk about for a minute, like the diversity in the police department, and like what could we do to like show more kids like the diversity. I know my cousin Anthony Andrews is a fireman,
Right.
and one of the things we had a conversation is about, you know, us in the African American community as young men, like in our neighborhoods, we didn't see like policemen or
Right.
lawyers or, you know, firemen. So it's something that we didn't know that was obtainable. So is there any plan to like talk to high school kids or career days or anything like that?
Yeah, so we work on a lot of career days certainly at local colleges. We have a criminal justice program we're a part of in the high schools here. So it's run out of EC Glass High
Okay.
School, but heritage students can come over to attend that as well. That's been in place for, don't quote me, I want to say 3 or 4 years at least
Gotcha.
now. And we get people that are officers in there, and we try and show exactly to your point. You know, we are being very transparent here. We are woefully behind as a police department in our diversity in terms of our officers' makeup reflecting our community. You know, we are about 85% Caucasian, unfortunately, in the department, and we need to do a better job of representing that. And I think one way to do that is exactly what you're saying. We need young men and young women who are Black to see themselves in a uniform, right? And we need to make sure that folks know, hey, that's something I can do, and show them great examples like Anthony or someone like that, hey, I've made a career of this, right? It's not just a job. This
Yeah.
is something that you can make a career of. You can, get good benefits, a decent pay, and we want to make sure too that, we recruit all over the place. We're all up and down the East Coast recruiting, but some of our best recruits come from right here in Lynchburg.
Yeah.
Literally before you walked in here this morning, I was just looking at a video of one of our young officers. Her name's Tarika Grooms. She's a Black female who grew up in this area. And she's out with a young little boy, I think over in Diamond Hill, who's riding around one of those little cars. I mean, he's probably 3, 4 years old, whatever he is, and she's out interacting with him, and those are the kind of things, to your point, that those little things, it may seem so simple, right? But those are little things that little boy or little girl sees her in uniform and thinks, wow, I could do that.
Yep.
You know what I
Something
mean?
they would
So-
like to do one day.
So I think sometimes people think it's got to be this big program, or it's got to be this big, event, or it's got to be this all this stuff, and we'll do those too, right? But it's those one-on-ones, man. I guarantee you that the video I watched this morning that just took place, I guarantee you that little boy or girl, right, is going to remember that.
Yeah.
And I guarantee mom and dad are going to remember that.
Yeah.
When they start to get older and think, hey, this is something I might want to do. They say, hey, don't you remember when Officer Grooms came by here? Here's the video, or here's the picture. So I think those interactions are really, really important, and I think help guide young men and women. So we're going to continue to work on that. Again, that's an area we need to work. And my kind of call to action, quite honestly, to our community is we need your help.
Yeah.
We need the folks who know who some of these young men and women of color are that can join the police department, right, and be successful. And we'll continue to push that. And then we're working on internally in the department setting up a diversity committee to make sure that we hear the voices of our Black officers, right? To make sure that, because their experience as a Black officer in this department is, I'm sure, very different than my experience as a white officer, right? And especially in these very, very difficult times that we're dealing with right now, they're getting pulled in both directions, right?
Yeah.
Like, quite honestly, where's your allegiance, right? Are you aligned with the police? Or are you aligned with
yeah.
us in the Black community, right? And that's difficult for them, I'm very sure. And so we want to make sure we have those conversations and make sure we're doing everything we can internally in the department, right? To set us up for success as well as out in the community. So.
Gotcha. So do you guys have any, like, since everything's happening, any group sessions where you're just kind of talking out as officers, just to vent, or?
Yeah, so I've been going around the last week and a half or so, and some of my command staff has as well, to kind of sit down with our officers and just hear what they got to say, because this is difficult times for everybody, certainly for a community, and certainly for our officers. And I think everybody, it's kind of, there's no playbook for this one, you know what I mean? There's nothing to look back and say, oh, this is what you do in this situation. So we've been going around meeting internally to try and have those conversations within the department to say, okay, hey, what are you seeing? What are you feeling, kind of thing, and then remind them that we have a great community here in Lynchburg. I truly believe that. I wouldn't have stayed here for 23 plus years if I didn't think that. And it's a great community to raise a family in, and there are a lot of people in and around Lynchburg that care to sit down and try and help other people out. And so try and remind them of that, because it's easy in times like this to get down, quite honestly. We got to make sure we keep lifting people up, both inside the department and out. And then, we're also doing some listening sessions in the community as well. So starting this coming week, we're going to be once a week doing different community centers and making sure that we understand, what's going on, right? Again, that whole perspective thing, and that whole, I can make an assumption that, I bet you I know what Jonathan's thinking, right? But the reality is I probably don't. So we're going to do those over the next several weeks to try and get a better feel for the concerns and get some feedback and make sure we've got a good understanding of what's going on in the community.
Okay. And I think police is just like any other job. In some jobs, you have jobs that are just reactive. And, it seems like you're being very proactive.
Right.
And if you can just go through some of the things that you have going on since the George Floyd incident, or since all the protests. I think these are great things because you're not waiting on something to actually go bad.
Yeah. I think we'd be somewhat derelict in our duty to sit and wait for the state or the federal government to mandate something, So some of the things that we've done, I mentioned earlier, with body-worn cameras and policies online and things like that. But, anytime you see something like happen, the very, very tragic death of George Floyd, and, no human being, including police officers, can look at that and say that was okay. I mean, I watched that video and was absolutely disgusted by it. To sit there and listen to him cry out for help, and that officer just lean on his neck and think, yep, I can do whatever I want to do. That's kind of the impression I got from it. So, I think anytime you see something like that, we're going to evaluate critically what we do and how we do it and why we do it. And a couple of things that we looked at initially is, we have never, I talked to an employee here who's been here since the late 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a police officer for 30 plus years. He retired, and he's been hired back as a part-time employee to do a variety of things. And I said to him, Mike, have we ever, since you've been here in the late 70s, trained anyone in neck restraint or chokehold? He said, absolutely not, But when we looked in our policy, guess what we didn't have in our policy? You can't use a neck restraint or a chokehold. Even though we've trained people to never do that and told them they can't, we didn't put it in our policy. So that's something we've already done. We've added that in there. The same thing with a duty to intervene. If officers see something that is taking place, that an officer is using excessive force, we've always trained our folks, you have to stop that. We didn't have that in policy, right? So we added that, as well as a duty to report. So if I see an officer doing something they shouldn't be doing, I've got a duty to report it to my boss and make sure that he or she is held accountable. And so those things are really important. We also looked at our body-worn camera program. We had instituted that in 2016ish, and at one point we had some court issues with releasing footage from our tactical unit. Right? So that's the unit that deals with high risk situations, whether they be barricades or hostage or anything like that. And we didn't have body-worn cameras on them because of some concerns with releasing operational type video, to a defense attorney who could then share it wherever they want. But we reevaluated that because of the George Floyd incident, and now we're going to put those body cameras back on those officers. And I still have those same concerns for the safety of my officers, but I also recognize that in today's day and age, they have to be on it. And so we've done that. Another thing we heard really early on from some of our community groups is, we've been meeting, I can't even keep track now, dozens and dozens of individuals and groups we've met with over the last several weeks. One of the things we heard early on was, hey, you guys don't have an online complaint form if somebody wants to file a complaint against an officer. And we looked at it and we said, you're absolutely right, we don't. And I mean, it's 2020, right? Like, you need to be able to do most things online. So our IT folks are developing that form right now, making sure the technology is behind there to support it and track it properly. And we'll be releasing that in the very near future as well. So that it's another mechanism for folks to make it easier for them to access information and to hold us accountable. And we'll continue to do those things. This is not I tell people, this is not a quick fix, right? Yeah. This is not something just going, okay, we did A, B, and C, check them off, we're done. Okay, we'll go back to how we did things now. And that's not it. This is kind of a marathon, not a sprint. And, we have to be constantly evaluating what we're doing. Even after we make improvements, we need to continue to evaluate and go forward.
Gotcha. And I like how you're doing it from the inside, because a lot of perception could be that, no one's changing anything. And I think that, when we take an antibiotic, it works from the inside out. And some people don't even know who's taking one. So I think you're doing a great job there. With working on a normal job, I think sometimes it could be hard for you to report another employee because you don't know what the repercussions are. You may or may not can answer this, but is the environment safe enough for one officer to report another officer if
Yeah,
they see something?
no, absolutely. So there was a story that went out in the media a couple weekends ago. I think now they contacted us for some data on complaints that we get, and so over a 5-year period through 2019, there were about 205 complaints that we received total. So out of those 205, so that's again over 5 years, so roughly 41 a year, right? Out of those 205 complaints, 54 of those were initiated by members of my department. So a little over 25% of the complaints about inappropriate behavior or anything along those lines or policy violations, we reported ourselves.
Gotcha.
I'm proud of that. I really am. Again, I'm not thrilled that there's people that potentially are misbehaving, right?
Yeah.
But in an organization of 200 people, sometimes you get that. But the fact that on 54 separate occasions, somebody inside my department said, "Hey, what that person's doing is not right." You know what I mean? Over a 5-year period, so that's almost 11 times a year that my folks have said that ain't right. Somebody needs to address that. So to me, that's again something that shows that there's a culture here and a climate here, to your point, where that's acceptable. Because you're right. I mean, nobody wants to be the one to say, "Hey, man, Jonathan's doing something really bad, man," and
Yeah.
especially when you work with each other. But if we don't have our integrity as police officers, we don't have anything.
Gotcha.
And so we got to make sure that we maintain that very, very high standard, because our community's got to trust us. And if they can't or won't trust us, that makes it very hard for us to do our jobs.
Gotcha. Now, another thing I thought was great, you talked about you guys put in for a grant with the mental health. Was it
Yeah.
Horizon?
Yeah, so we've got a long-term partnership with Horizon Behavioral Health here in the city. They are just a great group of people to work with, and they provide some exceptional services to our folks in the community here that are in mental health crisis and dealing with substance abuse and other things like that. And so I'd reached out to Damien Cabezas, who's the CEO over there, and talked to him. We've got a great relationship, and said, "Hey, here's something I'm thinking about. Would you guys be willing to do it?" And so there's a federal grant that's out there. We haven't heard back on it yet, but if we're awarded that grant, it would award us 3 positions: one police officer position, one that would be employed by us, obviously, one mental health clinician employed by Horizon Behavioral Health, and then a second position over there to do data analytics on this program. And what it would do is it would allow us to put a mental health employee professional in a police car with a police officer. So as we get calls for mental health related calls for service, they would respond as a team. Right now our officers are pretty limited. If we get a call that you're in mental health crisis and we get there, we have pretty much 2 options. We can talk to you and say, "Hey, good luck. Hope you do okay," and leave you as you are. Or we can take you into custody under what's called an emergency custody order, or an ECO for short. And that's a civil commitment. It's not a criminal act, but we physically have to take you, put you in handcuffs, and drive you over to the hospital and stay there with you while you receive mental health assessment. So, having that mental health clinician in a car with a police officer to respond to a lot of these calls is going to allow them to do some assessment right out there and say, "Hey, Jonathan doesn't need to go to the hospital involuntarily. We actually have a program that would benefit him. Let me call over there and see if they can connect with him and get that help." So,
Gotcha.
we really hope it's first and foremost going to provide better service to those folks who are in mental health crisis, who need something other than law enforcement services. And then secondly, we hope it will help keep from tying up a lot of our resources with dealing with that. So it's kind of a pilot. If we get awarded it, we should know in the fall whether we're going to get the grant or not. And if we do, my hope is that it serves as a great pilot program to then expand upon going forward.
Okay. Thank you for watching part 2 of my 2-part interview series with Police Chief Ryan Zuidema of Lynchburg, Virginia. He's agreed to do another interview series, so be on the lookout for that. I appreciate you guys for tuning in. Look, leave any comments below in the comments section, and just listen. It all starts with us as individuals. It's not dependent on the system, but it starts with us as individuals to try to make change. One love. Be blessed.